Hello and welcome back to this video series run in conjunction with Reboot, an initiative that allows us to hear from inspiring ethnic minorities that are making a mark in the corporate world. We are sharing these stories to help control the narrative, alter perceptions and biases, and delete racial inequality in the workplace. So today I'm delighted to be interviewing Lin Yue, Executive Director at Goldman Sachs Asset Management. Thanks so much for joining me today, Lin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here today.
Let's get to it. Can I ask you to talk a bit about your journey so far, what achievements you've made, your career progression, and what has made you the person you are today?
I will try. It's such a big question. So I spent the last decade in the city of London. So day to day, I work with institutional investors in the UK. And I'm also the president of the Rising Women's Network and then a thought leader, if you call it that way, on this intersection of business, behavior science, and diversity. But really, I think my greatest achievement so far probably being a mom of two very young children. And I'm also a carer for my mom. My journey is really starting some way back. If I can take you right from the beginning, because I came from mainland China. So as someone born after the one-child policy, I think what's really interesting about our life story is how that coincides with the biggest picture, which is the synonymous changes that we have experienced that China had for the past 4 decades. I think there was some analysis, for example, measuring this pace of change on the GDP per capita basis. So China on that basis changed over 30 times, whereas US is about 2 times. So you can think of it as a 16 times of speed. And that was our experience. So the common theme on our life is transition and change. And I remember the first time that I came across this West as a concept is probably when I was 4. That was the first time I saw this Western TV advert. It was a Head and Shoulders shampoo advert. So as intrigued as I was to find out what dandruff really was, I think I was just equally intrigued by the advancement this commercial represented. So it was back then, despite my very young age, I said to myself, I wanted to see more of that. I want to be part of that world. So it was that same curiosity that drove me through education, learning English, achieving a degree in the UK, and then working in the city of London. I mean, at some level, you can almost say that little girl's dream came true. I mean, I don't at least have any dandruffs. So, but I guess that curiosity of the world has really put me into this position to work with British clients directly. And you also asked what makes me who I am today. And that really made me think because before my life in finance, I studied behavior finance. And I think it is this curiosity in human minds and human behavior that was very instrumental in what I do. And then I think Simon Sinek might have said that 100% customers are people, 100% employees are people. So if you don't understand people, you don't understand the business. So I do see this behavior science background as a great way to access the financial markets, access business and diversity and leadership. Because if you look at what's driving the financial markets is not just numbers, it's the human behavior minds behind it. If you want to understand the dynamics of decision-making process from different institutions, that's again the human minds. And then also, how to drive the best performance at work as a leader, how to bring the best of ourselves to the office as employees. So I think all of it is probably a core piece of what made me what I am is that curiosity and then understanding of the human minds. But the one last thing I will mention is I very recently returned to work from maternity leave. So when they say a child was born, so was the mother. And I think in this case, it couldn't be more true because this is a great opportunity I see to almost embrace the different identities, as a professional, as a mom, as a carer, as a partner, as a woman, as an ethnic minority, as an advocate, to be all of the above, but also to be more authentic and more purposeful about my life and make a big impact.
Wow, there's so many fascinating elements to what you just said there. And yeah, so interesting that you followed through and you remember an advert from when you were 4 years old. And yeah, that's followed you through your career and propelled you forward. And yes, congratulations on recent maternity leave. And Yeah, as a fellow mum, I completely am in awe of you and everything that you're doing for the industry. So thank you for that. What practices do you believe still exist that reinforce racism and discrimination in the workplace and maybe hindering ethnic minorities' progression?
I've read quite a lot about the various researches. I think there is almost a few layers. So I think the first starting point is how our work culture was being set up in the first place. I think a lot of the big organizations that we work for, they were all set up, say, like 100 years ago. At the time, it was to support an ideal type of worker. And then that has been shown. When you think of that manager, you think of it somebody that is a man, but it's not just a man, it's a white middle class straight man. So I think when we think about the different dimensions of diversity, for example, one area is on, say, communication style. So what that means is actually this is somebody who is much willing to engage in a sort of dominate, assertive, aggressive, or competitive behavior to get ahead. And there are also the people who are much more willing to make work their number one priority in life. And then most likely they're free of dependent care responsibilities, like looking after children or the elderly parents. So I think this is really the starting point, how our organizations were set up in the first place. It wasn't with everyone in mind. So if you fit almost by default, you walk in. So it's very easier for you to access networks, to be seen, sponsored as a leader. It's simply because you fit the archetype. But then I guess the reverse is also true. The more ways you differ from that ideal standard, the more challenges typically you're going to experience try to advance at work. I think that kind of explains that this is the foundation of what the issue is to begin with. So if we look at the second layer, which is there's a lot of research that is most focused on women. And I think this is really helpful to look at it as a baseline, because when people look at women as leaders, for example, if they behave feminine, for example, then people will think that they are too weak and hence they're not leaders, because we have this what leaders look like, behave like already in mind, the default style. But then if women try to behave like men, the default style, then people think they are too aggressive and then they dislike them. So that they still can't be leaders, because when people don't like you, you can't lead. So there is a very narrow bandwidth for women to operate in. You need the right amount of authority, but you also need the right amount of warmth. So that is very hard to navigate in itself. But you add to the fact that there aren't that many female leaders to begin with, that insights of being a woman leader becomes very hard to access. And then the third layer, I would say, is then you add the differences on the ethnic minority or the intersectionality. And again, the McKinsey report really showed that women of color, women of ethnic minority background, they're having the worst time. And then, I'm from the East Asian community, and the East Asian women in particular, this culture factor could be 3 times worse than the gender factor. So that means, a white woman will be 3 times more likely to be a leader than a Chinese woman. So that's what the numbers are showing. So it's very common for people in this group to not even identify the challenges that women change, because they're so busy being Chinese or whatever that might be. So that, I would say, if you also add more layers to it, and then we talked about being a parent, why there's such thing called a working mom, not a working dad. I think there are a lot of common assumptions. So when we become mothers, we tend to prioritize families and start to leave the workforce. But actually, a lot of the research has shown this is not a lifestyle choice, because what normally happens is men and women start equally ambitious, but after having babies, when women go back to work, they're confronted by a different reality. They don't have the opportunities being available to them, the stretch project, the high profile initiatives. So when they can't access the same thing like they were hoping for all of a sudden the cost of being in a job that is going nowhere becomes way bigger because you want to be with your children. So I think it's not that women leave the workplace because they become mothers. It's the workplace didn't provide them the opportunities, and that's why they leave. It's the other way around. So I recognize I've outlined a few factors here. So really just to summarize that, number one is workplace isn't set up with everyone in mind. We have a default in terms of what leaders look like. Two is because women don't fit in with that leader's archetype. It is very hard to operate. We have very narrow bandwidth. Thirdly is women of ethnic minority find that ethnic origin playing an even bigger part than the gender factor. And lastly is this motherhood, even or being a parent to add further complexities. So I think this is really where I can probably point all of the research I've read and then the different layers that confronted us at the moment.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I can tell you have done your research. So what action should we be taking, particularly in financial services, to mitigate this?
I suppose the first action is probably a different mindset. I think, I mentioned the amount of changes I've experienced as growing up, but really it has been a huge amount for everyone in the recent years, from Me Too to Black Lives Matters, from COVID to ESG being part of the mainstream. I think these are long overdue changes, but really it provides us some insights into the future and what leadership is really looking like. Because tomorrow's organizations, they're no longer going to be about profitability, but inclusivity. It's not about just controlling anymore, but empowering. It's not about this privacy, but much more about transparency. So there's so much more that we can do for workplace to be more inclusive. But I think the number one action is to see diversity as just part of our business and solve it like a business issue. This is not an HR issue. It's not a tick the box exercise. It is not training. So that, I would say, is the number one thing that we really need to think about. The second point I will make is really we want to make our organizations more inclusive, but what does that mean? I think the challenge is we don't really know how to create cultures of equality or what it means to lead in an inclusive way. And then I think likewise, the employees perhaps don't fully appreciate or understand what it means to practice inclusion as part of their work. So to me, and then coming back to this behavioral science part, that diversity really is about change. We're asking people to think, behave, react differently. So the behavioral science can really inform us about how changes can happen. We have to make small but significant steps. It is not something that disconnected from the policy level. So I think that behavioral science piece is really where the business can lean towards and then solve it more like a business issue. But the last piece I would say is, everyone is on a slightly different path of this engagement curve of this topic. So, but importantly is we have to acknowledge not everyone is having the same reality at work, but no action is really complicit to the current status quo. I just don't think that is really the right side of history you want to be on anymore. So, while we don't have all the answers, but we really can have a test and learn sort of a mindset at the same time. This quote from Maya Angelou I really liked. What she said was, do the best you can until you know better. And once you know better, do better. And I think it's really good to have this kind of mindset in terms of diversity. We can all do better as we go along.
Fantastic. Thank you. Some really good points there. And so that's for the industry. What tips or advice would you give to other professional ethnic minorities or the next generation coming into the workplace?
We are in this industry where knowledge is power. But I don't think, right, in that case, self-knowledge got to be a very powerful thing to have. So looking back, a lot of the mistakes I have made, I would say maybe the top tip is to make a commitment to learning about yourself, but not in an indulging way, but because this awareness really forms the core of leadership, inclusivity, and cultural changes. Because I can give you an example because I never really spoke up in meetings before, because growing up in China, we were told, to pay our respect, to wait for our turn, and only speak when the answers are perfect. And it took me years to understand, for my colleagues, there are also three things are happening in their head when I didn't speak up in meetings. That means I didn't have views, I wasn't confident, or had no communication skills. So I think that there is a huge disconnection between what influenced my behavior and how that was interpreted. So knowing about this was hugely helpful, because that helped me understand not speaking up, that wasn't really me, that was my cultural influence. So now I can have a choice about how I want to behave in meetings. So that sense of control really gives me the confidence to really adapt my styles. And really, I think all of the leadership research point to tomorrow's leaders will be people who have multiple styles, as opposed to just one style fits all. So I think understanding these influences is really very empowering. And it also highlights we're not a problem that needs to be fixed. And this knowledge can help us become part of the solution. The longest journey, you mentioned about that earlier, I thought was that I came from China to the city of London, from east to west. But really, I have noticed and realized this longest journey was actually between my head and my heart. So, how can we create a space between, the stimulus and then the response that we have? So I think if we have that space, that we can become much more choiceful, intentional, and then that is really where that professional growth lies. So, being in the UK has been a very enriching experience for me. If I think about that 4-year-old standing in front of the TV, having this vision about being in the West, I think that vision, that dream have evolved massively for myself, because this is no longer a dream that we have to live for our parents' expectations. It's no longer a version that we just need to be successful. I think it's more about a journey that we can discover ourselves, find our voices, and with that sense of purpose to really define this emerging identity of our generation and to inspire the future ones.
Thank you. What great advice there. Thank you so much, Lin, for sharing your perspectives and personal experiences with us today. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I hope many members of the financial industry come along and listen to this video series and interview too.
Thank you so much for having me.